So today I'll be talking to you guys about British responsibility for the Simele Massacre, 1933. But first, just a little bit about me. So my name is obviously Zain, and I live between Dubai and London, and I go to a boarding school in London. And I think this has influenced my connection to the topic since I live in the Middle East, but I attend school in the UK, and I very much see it as the intersection between the West and their involvement in the region. And I'm also just generally very interested in the interwar period, since I think it's when the modern Middle East and the countries as we know it was really created and when the Middle East really came to life. But a brief history into, I guess, my topic. So the Assyrians are a transnational Christian population who are indigenous to northern Mesopotamia, which is basically like northern day Iraq. And they trace their lineage back to the ancient kingdom of Assyria, which is a civilization and then an empire. And their language and material culture still actually constitutes the oldest tradition in Iraq. British involvement in Iraq starts in 1921, when they gain a mandate to rule over Iraq. And this lasts until October 1932. Yet even when their mandate officially ends, they continue to have indirect influence and they remain in the country until 1956, when the Republic is established. In August 1933, there was a large massacre of the Assyrians, right after the British mandate is ended. It occurred when a group of Assyrians attempted to cross the border into Syria. Upon being rejected, there was a confrontation between the Assyrians and between the Iraqi army at a town called Peshawar on the border of northern Iraq. This triggered the Iraqi army to launch a mission against the Assyrians in northern Iraq, and it was led by a man called General Bakr Siddiqui. But it wasn't just Simele. During this period, over 120 villages in northern Iraq were destroyed, and over 600 Assyrians were killed, making it one of the largest attacks against the minority Assyrian population in this region. Now, why do I want to look at British responsibility for the massacre? I think A, it allows us to actually answer why the Assyrians were targeted in the first place. Because simply noting that, oh, the Assyrians were a minority, or oh, the Assyrians were different, just doesn't give us that explanation or that reasoning as to why the Iraqi state was so scared of this minority group and why they were subsequently targeted. B, it allows us to answer why the massacre was actually able to happen, since Britain had control over the country during this period and would have very much been in control as the massacre was being planned. But it also allows us to properly understand Britain's imperial legacy. Because we can't just look at the groups which are directly affected. We have to look at the groups which are indirectly affected by their policies and by their rule. And I'm going to look at it in 5 parts. One is the connection that Britain had built with the Assyrians. 2 is their actions across the Middle East, which led to the minority group being targeted. 3 is their short-term actions right before the massacre. And then just as a side, I'm going to look at the British response to the massacre and try and fit this into the narrative, as well as the future involvement in Iraq up till 1956. But first, a little bit on the context of the Assyrian relationship with the British. During the First World War, the British had made a national debt of honor to resettle the Assyrian refugees who were in Iraq, since the Turks had taken over the Hakkari region, which is where the Assyrians had previously lived. Unfortunately, subsequent attempts by the British were very much unsuccessful, so they couldn't find a solution, and so the Assyrians were forced to remain in the country. So moving on to the connection between the British and the Assyrians was achieved through the creation of the Assyrian Levies, which were created at the Cairo Conference of 1921. And their founding mission was to very simply serve until the Iraqi army is able to undertake their duties. Yet, despite this being their founding mission, they actually lasted up until 1956, with the only difference being that the Iraqi army served the state and the Assyrian Levies served British interests. So as part of my research, I was really lucky to be able to go to the National Archives in Kew Gardens. There, I was able to access correspondence between Mar Shah Shamoun, the spiritual leader of the Assyrians, and Sir Francis Humphreys, the British Commissioner to Iraq. And I had 3 main takeaways from the documents that I saw. The first is that the British had very much created a facade that they were very aligned with the goals of the Assyrian group. The letter that I show you is Sir Humphreys saying that he is working as hard as he can to obtain a reply from the League of Nations petitions that the Assyrian have sent in September 1932, effectively asking for a homeland and for the United Nations to help them find this. Yet, when you actually see private correspondence, it's very clear that the British actually rejected this idea of finding a homeland and the fact that the Assyrians had even sent a petition to the League of Nations in the first place. This second letter is the Assyrian leaders stating that they allow the Assyrian Levites to serve loyally and truly to the British, completely away from their control, which kind of shows how closely attached they would have been to the British. But finally, this element of control, which is shown here through Humphreys offering conditions to Marshallman for the Assyrian Levites to be able to serve. But also here, when Marshallman has to apologize for incidences that have happened in bases across Iraq, we just show how much control the British had over this minority group. What this led to is an incredible amount of suspicion from the Arab population, who worried that the British were using the Assyrians as a fifth column against nationalist aspirations, and that they were going to revoke the mandate in favor of the Assyrians instead of the Arabs. And this is shown in various Arab newspapers, where they say things like, oh, the Assyrians have assumed that they have special status, or that Britain has broken their pledges to everyone except for the Assyrian minority. So it's crucial to understand that it's really this fear which leads to the group being targeted initially. Second element is British actions across the Middle East, and their main involvement is very clearly in Palestine, where following the Balfour Declaration, they actively support the establishment of a Jewish homeland. This has two impacts. It leads to a lot of fear in Iraq, because the Iraqis view their situation is very similar to that in Palestine. And so the quote taken is from a cabinet minister who says, we cannot allow a difficult situation similar to the one ongoing in Palestine. But it also leads to the growth of pan-Arabism, because many pan-Arab nationalists, particularly from Palestine, but also from other Middle Eastern countries, now come to Iraq and they teach, and the education system is made very nationalized because of this immigration. This leads to the emergence of a group called the FNDF, a westernized middle class who start to call for the rejection of Western interference in the country, an ideology known as Pan-Arabism. And they're particularly angered by the Anglo-Iraq Treaty of 1930, where Britain basically says to Iraq, we'll give you independence, but we get access to oil and we get access to military bases even when our mandate is ended. This links to Simele, since the elite in Iraq are able to use the Assyrians as a proxy target for the British, because they're never going to cut ties with the British since they have that relationship ongoing between the ruling elite and the British. But they're able to use the FNDA and they're able to satisfy them and satisfy their belief through using the Assyrians as a way to show this rejection of the West. And so Simele is celebrated in Iraq as a victory against a foreign threat. Finally, and the last cause I'm going to look at is the short-term actions that the British had, focusing on two of the key events. The first is the Dashtazi settlement, which is the only British proposal for Assyrian resettlement during their period of rule in Iraq. The Dashtazi settlement in northern Iraq was far too small to fit the entire Assyrian population, and so it was constantly rejected. In 1933, right before the massacre happened, Major Thompson from the British was brought into the country, and when he proposed this settlement plan to the Assyrians, 4 out of 50 said yes, just showing that this settlement clearly wasn't a viable solution, yet it was the only option the British ever presented. Moving on to the Anglo-French discussions. This happened in 1933 when the group of Assyrians were at the border between Iraq and Syria, and members of the British government effectively traveled to France and persuaded them not to let the Assyrians in, despite previous agreements and previous clauses. And bearing in mind, this is basically like a few days before the massacre, the Assyrians are rejected, they go back into Iraq, and sadly, the massacre happens. Why this is relevant is I think that it illustrates that from 1920s to literally the days before the massacre, Britain had actively worked against the interests of this minority group. And so we can't just say that they allowed the massacre to happen, but I think in many ways they're very much responsible for it. And that their actions from the second they took that debt to find a homeland for the Assyrians is what led to the subsequent targeting. Now, quickly on the British response. The overt British response towards the massacre paints a very different picture, with the British condemning the actions of the Iraqi government and generals writing books about how upset they are by the massacre happening. But I think it's important to note the context behind this British response. At this time, the British were still very reliant on the US, and since there was such outrage in the US, this reputation was likely to save Britain's reputation in front of the West, and to ensure that they aren't criticized by the West and that they effectively fulfill this by acting angry against the massacre and by criticizing Iraq. And this is supported by what their future actions in Iraq are, because if they had been so opposed to the massacre, they would have continued doing what they did. What did they do? They remained in Iraq for so-called minority protection. They remained in contact with the ruling elite, who had basically carried out the massacre in front of their very eyes. They only would leave after effectively being forced to when a republic is established. They'd even praised Bakr Siddiqui, the general who actually orchestrated the whole massacre, as the best commander in the Iraqi army a year after Simele happened. On top of this, they give minimal aid to the Assyrian minority group who continue to serve them, and they also continue to utilize the Assyrian Levites until they are forced to leave Iraq in 56. Okay, but finally, why this is relevant. The Assyrians continue to be targeted in a region which they could once call their home. In recent decades, the Assyrian population has basically halved. And recent estimates, especially considering the targeting by ISIS, suggest that there will be no Assyrians left in Iraq by 2040, in a few decades. It also allows us to understand the legacy of British imperialism and the groups that have been affected indirectly by their actions. But finally, the Assyrians have very much been unimagined from the history of Iraq, since people in Iraq don't focus on it and view the massacre as, if anything, a victory against a foreign threat trying to take over the kingdom. And there's minimal Assyrians left to tell the story. So I just think it's so important to tell the history of this minority group, understand why they are targeted, and understand the causes behind their targeting in the Iraqi state. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Great job, Zain. That was really informative. So what are the next steps that you want to take with your research?
So my next steps, I've written a paper on it, and I think it's easier to get across everything when you have a paper of that length and when you have that many words to work with, just because there's so many different elements to it. There's so much context and background that you kind of need to set up in order to understand it properly. So it's obviously great to be able to have a presentation, but in order to get, I think, the full picture across, you just need those words, I guess, and you need that space to work with. So my aim is definitely to work on that research paper and try and have it published, and yeah, just share it across.
Awesome. Is there another topic related to this one that you would be interested in diving into more?
I think something related to Pan-Arabism. I think I find Pan-Arabism very interesting. It's what kind of drew me to this topic in the first place. Maybe establishing different types of Pan-Arabism in different Arab countries and looking at why in some Arab countries they accept Christians, they accept different minority groups, and it's just very inclusive to the region. Whereas in some, it is very focused on certain minority group, it excludes others. And I think Iraq definitely falls into that second category. So yeah, definitely something related to Pan-Arabism, but also, of course, the Middle Eastern region in general.
Cool. Was there anything that you learned through your research that was really surprising to you?
I think it showed me that you can't really just rely on what's out there. Initially, I tried to form a narrative based on what I read, and I think this links to the different approach you can have. And I just think I was getting the wrong narrative every time. I thought it was a situation of the British working with a group that they wanted to protect and a group which they had an affiliation towards. But I think it's important to kind of use the sources with a sort of constructivist approach and come to your own view. You can't just rely on what's out there, but you have to try and understand what the narrative is, what the narrative is likely to be like, and use that to form your own thesis and get an argument that's accurate and which you can argue well based on the evidence that you have.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, great. Thank you. So, oh, we have another question. What do you want to major in? Do you know
So
yet?
I think I know what I want to do long term and what I want to study. I think what I want to study is definitely history. I think I'm pretty leaning towards a focus on the history of the Middle East. I'm just really interested in the region, particularly the modern Middle Eastern history. But in terms of the future, I think I'd like to go into law. I think that's probably the long-term aim. So yeah, a lot of different milestones to work towards to try and get there long term.
Cool. Great. Thank you so much, Zane.